my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm doing a video to spotlight some poetry collections that I think are incredibly underrated. This video is coming out in August in order to celebrate the Seeley Challenge, which is a month-long challenge related to poetry that was created by the poet Nicole Seeley. I wanted to talk about some collections that I have read in the past 5 years, and also I believe that have all come out in the last 5 years that I think are incredibly underrated and are books that you should check out during the Seeley Challenge or whenever you feel a pull towards reading more poetry. I want to clarify what I mean when I say these collections are underrated. These collections all have, I believe, under 1,000 ratings on Goodreads, or just about 1,000 ratings. Most of them have much less than that. So I wanted to specifically choose ones that I felt like were not getting the recognition that they deserve, because all of these collections are ones that I rated 5 stars and that I feel very passionately about, that I think has an audience out there that just needs to find these works, because there are some really amazing poets that I have here. Some of them are established poets who have collections that have gone under the radar, but many of them are debut poets that I don't think received enough attention. Some of them, it might be the marketing behind it. Some of them, their synopses did not fully encapsulate the things that I think are most important from these collections. So I wanted to spotlight these not only because I really enjoyed them, I'm very passionate about them, but also because I want more people to read poetry, and I want more people to find poets, especially debut poets, who are being brave and releasing out into the world and are deserving of an audience. The first book that I want to talk about is, I think, the oldest one that I will be showing here, and that is Rangikura. Tayi Tibble is a Maori author who became pretty well known for her collection Pocahontas, which also came out a few years ago. I think it came out within a year of Rangikura. But this collection is a little bit different. This is more about Tibble's childhood growing into a young adult. It felt a little more grounded for me in terms of it being a reflection on her teenage years and how she was kind of trying to break out of these societal expectations of what was expected for a woman, especially a Maori woman. It is also a kind of love letter to her community and the traditions and the ways in which these themes shaped her journey into young adulthood. For me personally, there was just something that was so incredibly universal in the way that she talks about the journey of becoming a woman in a world that so often tries to shape or objectify us. And she meets this kind of gaze that the world throws on us with this really beautiful power and poetry that just sings off the page. This is one that is especially good as an audiobook because the way that Tibble narrates it, it's almost like a rap, and it feels incredibly atmospheric and vibrant, just full of life, and it's incredibly well done. The next collection is I Done Clicked My Heels 3 Times by Taylor Byas. This is a narrative arc that's actually modeled after The Wiz, and it's a kind of reflection on the poet's experience growing up on the south side of Chicago, but more importantly, it's kind of looking outside of harmful stereotyping of Black Chicago communities. It's looking more at the real day-to-day life of this poet and what she has experienced. I felt like this read not only as the adventures of Byas's life, I guess we can say, but there's also something that was so comforting about the poems here. This really highlighted the community that was around Byas. It shows the love of where she came from and the people that grew and evolved around her, as well as the literal place that she grew up in. This is a poet that was pretty heavily endorsed by Danez Smith when her collection debuted, and I definitely see why. I think both of them write about the places that they've come from with so much love, not just for the city themselves, but also for the people within them, the community that shaped them, and that love is so tangible here. The next one is Plantains and Are Becoming by Melania, Luisa, Marte. This is both an inner and an outer reflection on the term Afro-Latina. This is a lot about the poet's own experience, her own family, the kind of legacies of things that have affected her life, and I think that that is why this collection is so successful for me. It feels like the poet excavating this personal history and their own emotions, rather than trying to tackle a much larger conversation about why these things exist and how to solve these things. It isn't a guide to that, and I think that in some ways the initial advertising for this about it focusing on this deconstruction of the term Afro-Latinx kind of stigmatized people away from it, because I don't think that some people realize that this was a personal collection, not a clinical collection deconstructing this term in like a linguistic sense. Next up is Familial Hungers by Christine Wu. This is a collection that I really feel like just perfectly encapsulates one of my favorite things about poetry, which is the way that people can be so experimental in their poetry. I think that this is best described by a line on the synopsis that says, Wu relentlessly searches the grocery shelves for the hard to digest ingredients of identity and belonging. I love this imagery that this sentence creates because I think it is very representative of this collection and the way that food and people intertwine here. However, there are also some really emotionally impactful parts to this collection that are on language loss and strained parental relationships that go beyond these kind of food metaphors that the book is playing with. So for me, this collection was playful in some ways, in the ways that it used food to convey certain messages, but it also was really heavy hitting in the ways that Wu then moved away from that and focused in more on these harder themes that she wanted to explore. I think this next one actually came out pretty close to Familial Hungers, if I remember correctly, and that is We Contain Landscapes by Patrycja Humienik. This is a reflection on the kind of generational relationships between grandmothers, mothers, and daughters. The poet explores this through her kind of disconnect between her life in the United States and her family's life in Poland as they immigrated to the United States. Additionally, this collection felt like it was so much centered on women in ways that were very interesting because on the one hand, the poet is examining the relationships with her female family members and the way that that shaped her understanding of herself, her identity as a Polish American woman. But the poet is also queer and uses this collection as a way to examine her relationships with women as well. And not that she's making a comparison between them and her family. I don't want it to be misconstrued that there is some weird dynamic there. Rather, she's looking at the ways in which she has fallen in love with women and what is the kind of guiding theme in the relationships that she develops with women and why they end. I think these are kind of odd things to initially pair together, but the way that they are kind of looked at together here is this kind of examination of womanhood and legacy that I think is really beautifully done. And some of the love poems in this were really just so incredibly wonderful. The next one is Death Does Not End at the Sea by Gbenga Adesina. This one is criminally underrated. This has less than 100 ratings on Goodreads, which is truly tragic because this was one of my favorite collections that I read last year. This was an incredibly vulnerable reflection on fatherhood and migration. I think that this is the kind of vulnerability that is often missing in many collections for me. Besides perhaps Reginald Dwayne Betts, that was a collection Felon, which is kind of also looking at masculinity in a specific way. That's another unique perspective in terms of male vulnerability in poetry. But similarly, both collections kind of look at toxic masculinity and its lasting effects on the way that you turn into a man and also the way that you may parent your own sons. I really went into this not knowing if I would resonate with these poems because a lot of the description of it was centered on this concept of migration and fatherhood that I wasn't really sure how they would come together here. But there's a beautiful way that these are interwoven throughout this collection. And I think that Adesina is a very talented poet in the way that he weaves not only the poems themselves together, but this collection together as this very raw, realistic reflection on his life and his father's life and the hopes that he has for his own son. I really cannot understand how more people have not picked this one up because it was one in a year where I read, I think over 50 collections of poetry. And this is one of the strongest ones that I remember and one that I could easily label as my favorite from last year in terms of it conceptualizing something that I was really skeptical of reading about in the first place. Now, this next one is one that is much more experimental. And I'm gonna try to not fully gush about this because I think there's so much magic in kind of not knowing every aspect of this because of how experimental it is and what exactly it's deconstructing. So that collection is Becoming Ghost by Cathy Lynn Che. This is another one that was a favorite from last year, and it is a kind of response to Apocalypse Now, the film that was depicting the Vietnam War, and it's looking at the way that Vietnamese people suffered not only during the Vietnam War, but in the kind of exploitation after the war as it became a kind of media source. Che is examining this through the impact on her own family and also kind of challenges the reader in terms of who has the right to shape collective memory and whose voices are silenced in this process. There are parts of this where Cathy Lynn Che feels almost like a director of the collection. There is a very strong narrative voice from her throughout this because it's a very experimental form of poetry that she has collected here and is examining here. I don't want to go too much into it because again, I think the structure of this is something you shouldn't really be aware of before going into it because it is so fascinating how she has constructed this together. But I think the biggest thing in this is that she's taking ownership of her family's story and taking that away from the West and the people in the West who are trying to tell this story for her family, for Vietnamese people, which made it, of course, a very emotional read, but also really impactful in the ways that you feel how empowered she is through this collection. Now, the last three are actually ones that have been released in 2026. And this first one that I'm going to talk about, I believe, is actually the most recent because I think it was published in the beginning of July. This is 70,000 by Lenna Jawdat. This is a really fascinating new release. It's another one that's very experimental, kind of like Becoming Ghost. It is a collection examining the 70,000 books that were stolen from libraries and I believe also universities during the Nakba. Not only a collection of poems, but it's also a collection of visual art, as the poet is physically writing out through journal pages to the number 70,000. She's also creating some visual art pieces through the collection with these numbers, and also just additional pieces that have been added in. But the poets themselves are reflecting on this loss of history, education, knowledge, and how this one event then serves as a symbol for the 70 plus years of illegal occupation and genocide against Palestinian people. I think this was really unique in how it is moving away from the violence directly inflicted on Palestinian people and is instead focused on the ways that genocide manifests outside of that physical violence, how there are other ways of forcing people to lose a language, to lose knowledge and their culture that are equally damaging. That was something that really stood out to me in this, and why I think it's a very unique collection in what exactly it is examining and deconstructing here. So I think this is perfect for people who enjoy more experimental collections because it feels very unique in terms of things that I've read before. The next collection is one that's by an author that's pretty well known for her books, not necessarily her poetry, but she is a pretty well-known author nonetheless, and that is Visitations by Julia Alvarez. I would have expected her collection to have reached more people. This is a collection that is essentially telling the story of her life through poems. It's split up into these different phases of her life. I thought that this was really beautiful and also haunting in how it captured nostalgia, longing, and love. This is a collection that also felt so intentional in terms of what it wanted to explain to the reader, the organization of why she chose these certain poems to express certain events, and why she wanted to focus on these events throughout her life, because most of the collection doesn't feel like it's actually centering on her. It feels like it is centered on the people that had such an important role in her life, and the way that she feels very haunted by the losses of them, the memories that she has of them, and the nostalgia of these periods of time that she can no longer go back to. I felt this way especially about her reflections on her sisters and her relationships with her sisters. That was one of the most beautiful parts of this collection for me, and it has made me want to read her book How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, because that is partially inspired by her and her sister's experiences being moved from the Dominican Republic to the United States. Last but not least is another pretty well-known author. This is Aimee Nezhukumatathil. She is pretty well known for her poetry. She also has some memoirs and other like nonfiction books that I think most people are kind of familiar with. This one is called Night Owl, and this is one of those collections that just based on the synopsis sounds interesting. It's an ode to the ways that people and animals survive or thrive in nighttime. There is such a way that this poet writes about nature and animals that really just envelops you in the natural world. You can so vividly picture the places she's talking about, the animals that she wants you to learn about. It's really delightful. I think that this is the thing that I am always so impressed by with her works, is the way that I feel immersed in the worlds that she is explaining and crafting and curating for the reader. This one also covers some more serious and disturbing themes about racism, about anxiety, things that I think are really actually kind of fitting in this collection that is exploring the nighttime. She is not just diving into the joys and the comfort and safety of nighttime, but also the fears of night and the way that that kind of plays with our mind, and this concept of nighttime being a scary place when many scary things also happen during the day. I also think that in this, there's such an intimacy and a wonder to the things that she wants to explore in this that keeps it for me from being overwhelmed by darkness and the more sad parts of this collection. I think if you're a night owl that you will really love this. I also think if you're someone who is struggling right now with the ever scary changes of the world and things happening that are really hard to digest, this for me is a collection that offers hope and joy in these times that I think is really necessary. That concludes all the books I wanted to talk about today, and I hope that you have found some new poetry recommendations that inspire you to read from some new poets, or maybe these collections specifically. I would love to hear about your favorite poetry collections or collections that you think are incredibly underrated in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and happy reading. Bye!